Hi everyone, this is Kathy and welcome back to Hand Me Down Recipes. Today we have John with us, and John is someone I happened to meet at a pie auction in November. We're going to talk all about his pie crust recipe. How are you today, John?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I am good, thanks. I'm so excited. John and I met, for anyone who's not in Montana, we happened to meet at the Land to Hand pie auction right before Thanksgiving. And Land to Hand is a wonderful local organization that provides backpacks full of food for kids. They run a garden. They do a free to seed gardening program. They run our food library. They do all kinds of really wonderful things. And John and I both made pies for the auction. And John had this wonderful story about how his pie crust came to be. And as soon as I saw it, I knew I had to bring him on our show. So John, tell us a little bit about your pie crust.
Well, thank you. Absolutely. Yeah, it's really fun. My mother and my grandmother were prolific pie makers. And so when I was a little kid, I would hang out in the kitchen with them and they would be mixing and making and stuff. And as I continued to hang around, I slowly was brought into the process, and they had a very specific process, and my grandmother was very quick to point out if I was doing it wrong. So the ingredients had to go in a certain order, and then they had to be handled in a certain way. And I was gently schooled on the process of making this family pie crust. And it was great because I like to get my hands in there and enjoyed being in the kitchen with my mom and my grandmother. And they were I think they liked it because they always knew where I was at. I wasn't off somewhere else. And so in any event, the pie crust, it was just part of what we did. It was, and growing up, we used to have a summer place on Puget Sound. And my job as a kid was to go berry picking with my mother and pick wild blackberries, not the big ones you see in the grocery stores, but these are the little ones that are a little harder to get to, and there's a lot of sticker bushes and that kind of thing. But as a kid, it was an adventure. And so before we could do anything in the summer, go to the beach, meet our friends, do anything else, our job was to go berry picking. And I actually really enjoyed that very much. And the result of that is that there probably wasn't a night from mid-June to early September where there wasn't a fresh plum on the counter at night. And so I developed a strong affinity for blackberry pie and also the process. So anyways, over the years, my mother was known as the pie maker in our town. And I thought that was kind of cool.
That is really cool. I'm going to share that when I was growing up, my grandmother lived with us, and we would pick wild blackberries. I grew up in Western Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh, and we would pick wild blackberries, and that was what she would make pies out of it. And so it just touches my heart that was like your growing up too. Now, the pie crust that my grandmother made was nothing like the pie crust that yours made. My grandmother did kind of just lard and flour and salt and ice water. But your pie crust recipe happens to have eggs in it and a little bit of vinegar. Eggs. No, it's just one.
Just one egg. This is
And
half a cup of cold water, one egg, a teaspoon of sugar, and a teaspoon of I'll tell you about the upgrades by a teaspoon of vinegar.
yeah, tell us about the upgrades, because I know, because we talked a little bit beforehand, but go ahead, tell us about the upgrades to your.
So growing up, of course, this is in the early '60s and beyond. The go-to for everything was I don't know if you can see it. I'm sorry, my cat just stepped on my keyboard. The go-to was Crisco. It was that's what everyone used, and then Imperial margarine. Remember the ads for Imperial margarine, and then gold medal flour. So and then your just typical white vinegar, and then your C&H sugars, all basic stuff that was very prevalent in the 60s and 70s. My mother passed away in 2007, and for her memorial, we got together. We all went pie picking, and we actually baked. I believe we baked 50 pies for her memorial. So we said goodbye with her pies. Well, after that, I moved to Montana full time. I've been in and around Montana my entire life, but I made it my full-time residence in 2008. And I'd already been indoctrinated into the huckleberry picking, which was a great extension for blackberry picking. And I really prefer it because there's no stickers. In the old bears, I don't like the stickers, right? And so I became, huckleberry picking has and is one of my favorite things to do in the summertime. And then now I've got this pie crust recipe. And so I decided I was going to make a huckleberry pie. And it'd probably been a few years or more than a few years since I'd really actually made a pie. So I pulled out this whole recipe and I started looking at it. I thought, I wonder if I can upgrade this recipe. I'm going to keep the basic ingredients the same, but I'm going to upgrade it. So I found that Montana wheat makes a really good baking flour, and I like using local stuff, right? And then what's the name of that place? There's a meat place out in the valley. Anyway, so I found that I could get locally made lard. And a little tip. There's a term called leaf lard, and the leaf lard is a pure lard and it provides a flakier crust. So then as far as the sugar goes, because it sounds good, I went with an organic sugar or organic cane sugar versus a more traditional processed sugar. And then I upgraded. I'm sorry, here comes the cat. There comes the cat. And then instead of just using the typical Heinz white kitchen vinegar, I started using the Bragg apple cider vinegar. And so what I found was that all these ingredients kept in the same proportions that I had always used. And then I use a farm fresh egg versus just an egg, right? And so if nothing else, I felt better about it, but I feel that it's definitely resulted in a really quality pastry crust that over time, I mean, I make it because I like it. It's fun. It's something to do, and I enjoy it. And I would be serving these pies and taking them to potlucks and whatever. People start coming up to me and going like, "Where'd you get your pie crust? Where'd you get your pie crust?" And I said, "Well, I made it. It's you actually made the pie crust?" I was like, "Yeah, I actually made the pie crust." And so I started getting more and more inputs on this, and so it sort of validated that the upgrades were a viable improvement, if you will, to the family recipe. Whereas it's a family recipe, it's only been altered by the quality of the ingredients. As far as I'm concerned, everything else has stayed exactly the same. And the only thing that's different is the recipe that my mother passed down to me, and it has written on her card that you can make 4 pies from this recipe. And I've never been able to make 4 pies from this recipe. And I've started doing the math, and I realized I'm probably using a larger pie pan. And she was adamant about making the crust as thin as possible. I kind of like a little bit more density. So I go for about 1/8 of an inch versus less. So about 1/8 of an inch rolled out is my kind of gold standard, if you will.
Right. And when you mentioned the local, are you rendering your own lard, or did you find someone?
There's a place out in West Valley that does that. And I'm sorry.
That's okay. We buy from farm to market pork often, and I render my lard from the lard I get from that. So I have rendered my own, and that's what I used to make it. So I was just curious if you were.
Well, we're going to have an offline conversation about that, because whenever I can do it myself, I like to move that direction. So I'm going to have to learn how to render pork next.
Yeah, it's really easy. I will say I don't love the smell of it, so I do it outside. But yeah, I do it, and it's super easy. And I just, I keep it in the fridge. Supposedly it's shelf stable. I always worry a little bit about it for some reason, so I freeze it. Yeah, it's easy. And that's what I used to make the pie crust when I tested it, and it worked fine.
See, that sounds lovely. Yeah. So are you familiar with the leaf lard?
Yeah, and that's what you get when you we get it from.
Okay.
From when you, I mean, I suppose it would depend on where you get it, your pig and your lard from, and how they butcher, but that's what you get. So yeah, it's really easy.
I'm down for learning that technique, because I had a bit of a crisis coming up to Christmas. All of a sudden I couldn't find any lard. It was like, oh my gosh, this is, a red flag alert here. I've got pies to make and I don't have lard, and there's no way I'm going to use Crisco.
Yeah.
So what you might have to divert.
Yeah, I've used butter in a pie crust in a pinch, and it's okay, but lard is better.
I agree.
If for people who are kosher or whatever, if you don't eat pork for some reason, you could use butter, I'm sure, or Crisco, and be acceptable for if you don't eat pork products, you can find other substitutions. And I do use rags, the vinegar, because that's what I always have in my own kitchen as well. And I did try it. I had some pastry flour from King Arthur, and it's a finer than the normal, like the all-purpose baking flour, even from Montana. And so I tried that. It was really soft, just because the way the protein is in that particular flour. I'm going to try the pie recipe again without the pastry flour and use regular flour. So it was interesting how that turned out. But it was really delicious. And of course, your recipe has you refrigerating the pie crust before you roll it out.
Correct. Yeah.
Right.
Once I make the initial batch, then I just roll it into a ball and I refrigerate it for a minimum of 2 hours, but it freezes perfectly. As a matter of fact, for Christmas, I gave my sister-in-law, who's always saying she doesn't have the time to make pie crust, and so she never does. So I made her a batch of pie crust and broke it up into 4 little balls and put it in a box and wrapped it and gave it to her for Christmas. And she was like, "Oh, this is great."
That's great. That's
so it freezes. I mean, I've never froze it for an extended period of time because I use it. And what's great about it, people are like, "Oh my God, how did you have time to make this pie?" I say, "Well, the pie crust is already made. It's not preformed. It's just in a ball."
Yeah.
Takes, I take it out of the freezer the morning up, prepare my filling and do other stuff, and then come back and bam, you got a pie. And it's very efficient that way. There have been times where I've gone from no pie crust to finished pies, and that just, of course, I got a couple hours of refrigeration time I guess I'm curing the crust. I'm not quite sure what's going on in there, but it's just chilling out for 2 hours, and then it becomes much more workable.
Right. And I too keep pie crust in the freezer. I always feel like if I'm going to make it, I might as well just make a little extra and freeze it and then have it for the next time. So especially like after the holidays now, but you seem kind of like a pot pie, like a meat pie. And so if I've got the pie crust in the freezer, it's so much easier to pull it together with leftover or something.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I've done a little experimentation with meat pot pie and also using it for a quiche, right? And it was as expected. It performed beautifully. And the one thing with, I'm interested, do you pre-bake your crusts? A lot of pie makers talk about that. I don't pre-bake my crust, and I use a ceramic pie pan to get even heat distribution, and then also place that hot pie pan on a baking sheet in the oven. That was a little trick I saw on YouTube, and that seems to also. I always get I don't have the a soft or doughy or uncooked bottom crust. It's always seems to be just fine.
Yeah, no, I don't pre-bake unless it's like a custard, like a for pumpkin pie, I will often because it'll get a little soggy with the pumpkin. But like if I'm doing a fruit pie or something, no, and I don't like pot pie either. I just make sure the filling is cold, or not hot, room temperature.
Right. Thank you for bringing that up, because it's another. I don't know if I've mentioned this or not, but one of the things they do is after I roll out and form my base crust in the baking pan, I put it back in the refrigerator while I'm preparing everything else and just let that chill down again, because it warmed up a little bit while I was rolling it out and doing that kind of thing. And that tends to lead to, that kind of gold standard of having kind of a flaky, flavorful crust, not a dense, doughy crust, right?
Right. That is the chemical reaction, right? Like when the fat is sold and then cooks, that's what makes it flake up.
Yeah, I'll go with that.
I'm sure I learned that on I'm totally forgetting his name, but it was a guy on Food Network who used to have like a show where he explained it all. Good Eats, Alton Brown. He explained that. I know he explained it one time on an episode probably 20 years ago, and that's how I learned that. The colder the fat, the better it is, which is also why for science, for anybody who's curious.
Right. Yeah. Okay. That's exactly right. I didn't really understand the science behind that. I just knew that it worked. So I have a tendency to stay with the things that work. So what's your favorite pie to make?
I love just a regular old apple. I know that's so boring. I love an apple pie. I always have. It's probably still my favorite, but I often make raspberry pie because we grow raspberries and have a really productive patch. It's not very large, but it just seems to be very productive. So
awesome.
Yeah, and that's what I made. I have a bunch in the freezer, and I made some raspberry pie with your pie crust, and that's what I had made for the pie auction too, with the raspberry pie.
So interestingly, I've never made a raspberry pie because that just was never in my experience. I don't think I've even had raspberry pie now that I think of it. But I have a raspberry patch, but that is generally reserved for jam.
Yeah, yeah, and I like raspberry jam. And I make plenty of that because there's so many. I like a mixed berry pie a lot too. So I will often do a mixed berry pie where I just throw whatever because there's Saskatoon service berries that grow really close to me, and I'll just grab whatever thippleberries, raspberries, cranberries, whatever I got. And I love.
So arguably my favorite pie growing up was cherry pie, right?
Oh yeah.
And now the huckleberry pie is really kind of a thing, but they're also very time consuming to collect
Yes.
and they're valuable. And what I have found is that I make a huckle cherry pie, which is one of the pies I did. I brought two pies to the auction this year, and I did a huckle cherry and then a full huckleberry. But I really like the huckle cherry because I'm with you. I like mixing the fruits. And then I had a great experience this last year. My brother brought me a variety of apples from a friend of theirs that has a family orchard in the Wenatchee area. If you're familiar with Wenatchee, it's certainly the apple capital of the world.
Yeah.
And I had a variety of apples that I mixed together, and then I pre-can the filling. I, pre-make that filling, can it in large jars, and then it's really quick to make a pie that way. And this is probably some of the best apple pie I've ever had. It was because it just had this really unique blend of, had some golden delicious and then some tart, more tart apples, some Granny Smiths, and then some Fuji's, I think, or something like that. And I kind of like to think of myself as, kind of has a winemaker, kind of gets into all the mixing stuff. I do that with pie.
That's great. No, I love it. That's really good. And so when you are you using the sour cherries or are you using the flathead sweet cherries?
I'll admit, I'm using a pre-made canned cherry. I went down the path of trying to pit my own cherries. A friend in Columbia Falls had an amazing cherry tree with all these cherries on it. And the time involved in pitting all those cherries and dealing with them, it was just like, yeah. So I actually sourced a really high quality pre-made cherry pie filling, and it works great. And then I mix in my huckleberries with it. So, maybe I'm a little bit of a cheater like that. If I could source a really good flathead cherry that was already pitted and that I could turn into a cherry pie filling, I would do that, but I haven't gone that far yet.
So I'm gonna say, because we live in the land of sweet cherries, and I can a lot of cherries, or I used to, depending on the price of cherries, the flat cherries. But we have a pitter. So it has like a little hopper, and it goes down the chute. You just push the little thing, and it pits them right through, and it goes into a little collection. You can do it pretty quick with that little pitter. It will look like you committed a mass murder in your kitchen because the cherry juice spits everywhere. So again, do it outside. But we do that, and it doesn't take that long with that. So I would recommend that. I don't know. I'm sure I bought mine secondhand somewhere, but I've seen them all over the place. So they're really worth having, and it just has a little thing that collects the pits, and you can toss them. It does the cherries. It does a pretty good job. Every once in a while, if you go too fast, it will miss.
I'll definitely have to consider that. So speaking of committing mass murder, after a day of huckleberry picking, I stopped into the local convenience store right here off of Wisconsin, and I walk in, and of course my hands are all purple, right? And the guy behind the counter says, you either just strangled a Smurf or you've been huckleberry picking. I'd never heard that one before. That was pretty funny. Yeah, no.
It's a badge of honor in Montana.
Exactly.
Very good. And as we get back to the pie, do you have any other tips or tricks that you think people should know before they try your pie crust?
It's surprisingly simple if you just follow the basic recipe. Chilling that pie in the pan, I think, is probably the thing. And then yes, the other thing I use is I have an oven that has a convection option, and I always cook my pies on convection heat because it draws more of the moisture out, I understand. And so when I started doing that, when I upgraded this oven a couple years ago, I noticed my pie crusts and relative things were just a little better quality. I do sprinkle some sugar over the top of it. I think I mentioned that in my recipe too. So just give it a dusting of sugar over the top, and that kind of binds with the lard and the other stuff, and it makes a kind of a nice little crusty pastry top. Typical venting, you can design a vent however you want to. I have been fiddling around with different types of fluting, and I have this one where I just kind of roll it, and instead of doing all the pinching and all that kind of stuff, I just do this rolled crust. I call it a French roll. I don't know if it is or not, but that's what I call it because it makes you feel good. And that seems to give me a good consistent crust. And then most people are aware of using a foil ring or some kind of protector for the crust. So 30 minutes into baking my pie, or 20, I set my timer for about 25 minutes to just take a peek. And then I have one of these metal ring, and then I add some foil to it to kind of tighten the diameter of the circle a little bit so I don't overcook that edge. And so it tries to come out even. And then my experience has been the pie is done when the filling starts to squeeze out somewhere. So that's my metric.
Yeah.
And it usually is done within 45 minutes or so, depending on, I try to make sure my filling is at refrigeration level. I used to just throw a frozen filling in, and I realized that wasn't giving me the results I wanted, a little too watery. And of course, fillings are a completely different conversation. We're really talking about the crust. So I know what you do with your filling to make it consistent and work with your pie. Then this crust is pretty versatile. And like I said, I've used it for quiche. I've used it for meat pies, chicken pot pies, but my favorite is the various fruit pies.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I am going to share the recipe so that folks can have it, because John is not a
Please do.
fierce.
It's open source.
So we'll have it nice for everyone to do this. And John, I thank you so much for sharing your family story and all of your history with us and the recipe. Thank you so much.